It's really kind of funny watching the religious try to explain things that they have absolutely no evidence for just because they really want it to be true. It doesn't matter what it is, if they have faith, they have explanations. Too bad those explanations aren't rationally defensible, right? So here we go again. We've done William Lane Craig to death around here. We've probably done most apologists that way. But you have to have someone to talk about, and Craig is one of those gifts that just keeps on giving. He just makes a fool of himself in front of a fawning audience because Christians, they don't tend to be that smart when it comes to their religious beliefs. So here comes a segment of a podcast in which Craig tries to explain the resurrection and only winds up proving what a complete dipshit he is. Because that's a surprise. I'm not sure why we're supposed to be impressed.
My faith came alive when I understood the historical, actual physical reasons for believing in Jesus.
It would sure be nice if you guys could actually explain that, because it doesn't seem to stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny whatsoever. This is absurdly common among the religious, isn't it? We have evidence. Great. Where is it? Present it. Trot it on out here. Uh, uh, we have evidence. The second you discard blind faith from the mix, they've got absolutely nothing. My book says a thing. Great. Why should I care about that? Lots of books say lots of things. They don't know what to say to that because they don't care about defending their actual beliefs. They don't care about proving that what's in their books are actually true. They just want to believe. However, this isn't about the bozo on the left. We're here to watch William Lane Craig make a fool out of himself, as he always does. So let's get back to the action.
And your explanation of the reasonable, rational approach to understanding the resurrection and the reasons for believing in the resurrection really took my heart by storm. So I just would like to hear you talk through what reasons a skeptic has to consider belief in the empty tomb of Jesus.
Sorry, I just had to jump in here. But you have to remember, this is Low Bar Bill we're talking about here. He is never, ever, ever going to live that down. If he actually had any evidence, he wouldn't have to talk about the witness of the Holy Spirit or lowering the epistemic bar. He'd just present the evidence. That's why his entire repertoire is, well, I say a bunch of stuff, therefore God. But that's not evidence. Philosophical arguments are not evidence. We want evidence. We want you to prove that there actually was a guy named Jesus. Well, Jehoshua ben Joseph is probably more likely. That this guy was demonstrably the son of a real existing God, and for that you'd have to prove that God was real in the first place, which we all know you can't do, and that he actually came back from the dead in some objectively verifiable way. Got any of that? Well, of course not, and he doesn't care. But that's the kind of thing that you'd have to be able to produce if you wanted to impress the non-religious. And that's why he's not on stage with a skeptic. He's there with somebody who's just kissing his ass. Anyway, like I said, we're here for Low Bar Bill, so let's finally let him speak.
Yes, I did my doctoral work in theology at the University of Munich in Germany on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And although at that time as a Christian I believed Jesus rose from the dead, I frankly had no idea of how firm the historical credentials for that event are.
Really? Why don't you just trot that evidence out for us to examine? Again, if you have all this evidence, why do you spend all of your time talking about faith? Faith is irrelevant in the face of demonstrable evidence. Now, of course, he won't have any that he can prove. I think we all realize that going in. This is just going to be, well, my book says a thing and I have faith. But that isn't evidence. That's just empty claims. Claims don't mean anything. The title of this video is Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus, and he won't have anything worth anything to report. He might be willing to lower his own epistemic bar, but I'm sure the hell not. So let's get on with it.
There are 5 facts that are widely agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians today, whether conservative or liberal, Christian or non-Christian.
Right.
Oh, good. We're going to do Gary Habermas's minimal facts argument. You know, that thing that started out with 12 claims, then it went down to 6, and now maybe Craig has it whittled down to 5. Frankly, I'm not impressed with any of it, but I'll let him get them out before I tear them all apart. Generally speaking, though, my objections tend to come down to faith, sake of argument, or we just want jobs in a field overwhelmingly dominated by fundamentalist Christians. But let's see what he's got, shall we?
And these would include that Jesus of Nazareth died by Roman crucifixion for claiming to be king of the Jews.
You can't prove that. Your book claims it, but you can't prove that Jesus existed at all. This is a story in a book of mythology. It is not a demonstrable historic fact. Like I said, most of this is done for the sake of argument, because if you don't agree to the basics, then the religious aren't going to talk to you at all, and you don't get to sit up on a stage in front of a live studio audience, and you don't get paid. This is not a legitimate basis for scholarship. Therefore, since I'm not in this for the money, I entirely reject that claim as not evidentially supported. Produce the evidence that showed that it actually happened. Do so outside of your big book of multiple choice. Go right ahead.
Secondly, that his body was then interred in a tomb by a delegate of the Jewish Sanhedrin, whose name we have, Joseph of Arimathea.
Except that's not supported either. We know that the Romans left crucified criminals up on the cross to rot, and thereafter they threw them into mass graves or let the birds and the dogs eat the bodies. We have one and only one example where any crucified individual was buried, and we don't even know the details behind it all. For all we know, that person was exonerated following crucifixion. Perhaps the real criminal came forward upon seeing the horror of crucifixion, and they allowed the family to take the body and bury it. We just don't know. There is no evidence in the case of Jesus that any of that happened. Mostly because we can't even prove that Jesus existed at all. Secondly, there's no evidence that Joseph of Arimathea was even real. Hell, we can't even say with any certainty where Arimathea was, if it was anything at all. People have guessed in a desperate attempt to validate the Bible, just like they did with early 20th century archaeology, where they went out with a shovel in one hand and a Bible in the other. But if you look at the word Arimathea, it derives from the Greek meaning best disciple town. The place where the best disciple, the guy who stayed behind when everyone else had abandoned him, to take care of Jesus' body. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't real, but we sure don't have any significant evidence that he was.
That tomb was then discovered empty on the first day of the week by a group of Jesus' female disciples.
Again, outside of the empty claims made in your book of mythology, where is your evidence for that? This doesn't get you any farther than asserting that Harry Potter had a scar on his forehead because that's what it says in a series of books. We need independent archaeological evidence for this stuff, and you don't have any of that. We need independent, direct, demonstrable eyewitness information, and the Gospels were written anonymously by people who we have every reason to doubt were actually there. Everything here is hearsay or oral tradition at best. That doesn't make it true. So what else you got, Bill?
That thereafter, the various individuals and groups experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death.
Well, that's the story. Now, how do you back it up? Because today, there are people who tell stories of seeing stuff all the time. That doesn't mean that it actually happened. You can go and interview thousands of people right now that claim to have seen aliens. That doesn't mean that they did. You can interview people who say they saw Bigfoot. That doesn't mean that they did. This is what happens when you take stories seriously without independent and objective corroboration. And this is why these people end up looking like complete idiots.
And finally, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary.
Again, that's your story. Now, show that it's true. Now, I'm not saying that early Christians might not have believed that it happened, but that doesn't make it so. Scientologists believe in Xenu, and that's just batshit insane. Belief in a thing doesn't mean that that thing is real. You have to do a whole lot better than that, and Bill knows that he can't. That's why he relies on blind faith and wishful thinking. Unfortunately, you've got an awful lot of non-religious historians and New Testament scholars who are forced to go along with this stuff because if they don't, the overwhelmingly religious, fundamentalist Christian field, they just won't talk to them anymore. They won't have any respectability, and they'll have to go find other jobs. I am firmly convinced that that's what this comes down to. Not evidence, not being convinced that it's true, survival. They have to agree for the sake of argument, or they don't eat. But then again, I have a much higher epistemic bar, which is why I'm not going to play along.
Now, in support of each of those 5 facts, there are multiple lines of evidence that I lay out in the book so that the vast majority of New Testament historians today are convinced that those are factual, historical.
So go buy his book. Now, I'm not saying that he intended it to sound that way, although, really, who the hell knows? Bill has a hell of an ego, but it sure as hell sounds like that's what he's saying, that the vast majority of New Testament scholars are convinced because he said so in his books. Yeah, the problem is that none of his lines of evidence mean anything because they all rely on faith and not demonstrable facts. That's how religion works, after all. He wants to get to the conclusion that his God exists, therefore all these other things just have to be true because, well, of course they are. That's just not impressive to anybody who isn't forced to go along with it to make ends meet. And that means I don't think it's credible at all.
Yeah.
The question then is, how do you best explain them? And here various hypotheses have been proposed. The conspiracy hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, the wrong tomb hypothesis, and what I call the resurrection hypothesis, that God raised him from the dead.
And that one convinces you because that's what you want to believe. Of course, what you want doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter what you want. It matters only what you can prove, and we all know he can't prove a damn thing. That's why faith is such a meaningless thing. Anybody can have faith in anything, no matter how absurdly wrong it is. Faith proves only your own gullibility, and Bill, as we all know, is incredibly gullible. The fact that he makes millions and millions of dollars stringing the religiously stupid along, that's not a bad thing either, right? Well, not if you're him. I mean, it is if you actually care about the objective facts, something that Bill has proven conclusively time and time again that he doesn't give a damn about because he just wants to believe.
And I think that when you assess these alternative historical hypotheses using the standard criteria for weighing historical explanations, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness or artificiality, and so forth, that the resurrection hypothesis emerges head and shoulders above any of these naturalistic alternatives, and that therefore by far the best explanation of the evidence is the one that these original disciples gave. God raised him from the dead.
You, my friend, are out of your ever-loving mind. Absolutely nowhere is magic a better explanation than things that can actually happen in the real world. He's only going with magic because he's emotionally conditioned to agree with it. But newsflash for you, Billy boy, magic isn't real. I know that's hard for you to accept, but grow up. This is exactly why faith is such a complete waste of time. Nobody cares what you want to be true. We care only what is demonstrably true. And this is why miracle claims like the miracle of the sun in 1917 are so damn stupid. Catholics are convinced that it's magic, but it's a whole hell of a lot more likely that staring at the sun is going to cause hallucinations and, damage to your retinas. This is where faith fails. Nobody cares what you want. We only care what is true.
Wow. So all of the 5 facts are historically attested, and many of them not just in the Bible or by the scriptures. It's attested, these facts are attested by other historical ancient sources that coincide with the scriptural attestations of Jesus, these events of his death and burial and resurrection.
Oh, look, more gibberish. What things outside of the Bible demonstrably attest to any of this? Because you said it, not me. Because here's the problem. They don't have anything at all to present. People like Craig, they'll point to, 1 Corinthians 15:6, which claims that 500 people saw Jesus. Really? Prove it. What were their names? Where are their independent accounts of these events? Anybody can make a claim. Claims don't mean anything. If I wrote a book that said I flapped my arms and flew around the city and 1 million people looked up and saw me, what does that prove? It proves nothing. It says, well, you can go ask them. Cool, who were they? Even at the time, you couldn't have done that. You have to remember that 1 Corinthians wasn't written until 53 or 54 CE in Ephesus, which is over in Asia Minor. That's about 650 miles as the crow flies from Jerusalem. So for people who rarely went more than a couple of miles from their homes, how are they supposed to verify these stories that happened 25 years before in a place that they were very unlikely to ever visit? How does that work exactly? Because I'd love to have somebody explain.
And the point Dr. Craig makes so profoundly is that if all these 5 things are historically attested, then they must be explained. And the hallucination theory you didn't mention, but that's my favorite explanation, sort of ridiculous explanation of folks that really get backed into a corner with those 5 facts because Jesus really died on a Roman cross.
Again, prove it. Now, I don't know what the hell this guy is doing other than making a complete fool of himself. I mean, Craig just said it. You don't have to summarize for your idiot audience. It just happened. Why do these people not have any short-term memory at all? We don't have any records at all from the Romans that any of this happened. We just don't. All you have is a story in a book of mythology written decades after the supposed events, and you can't independently verify any of it. It's all faith and fee-fees, and that means absolutely nothing at all. And if you notice what he's doing, that's exactly what most theists do. The hallucination explanation is my favorite, and then he just dismisses it out of hand without ever evaluating it at all. Why? Because that's not the answer that he wants. We see this all the time with religious arguments. It's either X, Y, or Z. And it's not X or Y, so it's got to be Z because that's the one I want to be true. Sorry, that's not how rational evaluation works.
Yeah, these naturalistic explanations are so bad.
They're so bad.
That you will typically find that those who do not believe in the resurrection of Jesus don't propound any of these naturalistic alternatives. Instead, they just remain agnostic.
Yeah.
They just say, something incredible happened that Easter morning, and we don't know what it is.
Right.
And so they simply have no explanation.
Yeah.
It's not our job to come up with one. You're the one that proposes that something happened. It is 100% your job to prove it. You've got a story. That's all you've got. You've got to convince us that your story is true, and you're really, really bad at it. It's like talking about Roswell. Well, If it wasn't aliens, then you've got to come up with a better explanation. No, I don't, because I'm not the one claiming that it wasn't aliens. I am saying that I am not convinced by your arguments and by your evidence that it was. I've got no burden of proof whatsoever. Whatever happened, we don't know what it might have been. And I'm satisfied to leave it there until we have some evidence that says conclusively otherwise. And the same goes for Jesus. Faith goes right out the window. It doesn't matter what you want to believe. You have a story. Now, prove the story happened as you purport. I don't care what convinces you, I care what convinces me. And I am not convinced of the veracity of your tale. Do better. I don't care what you think that rustling in the woods was. I am not convinced that it was Bigfoot. Do better. There's a big difference between what you have and what you need, and that's why these people spend all of their time talking to their sycophants, because they're not going to be asking any hard questions or demanding any actual support for their claims. They're just not that bright. They have a predisposed belief in the crap that you're trying to push. We don't. If you're talking to us, as you should be, then you've got to produce something better. And you have to do better. Maybe they ought to try to do something about that. I don't know. Because what they've got right now is utter crap.